I'm Sharon Squassoni, and I direct the Proliferation Prevention Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. I'm here with Dr. Alan Hanson, who is the Executive Director of the International Nuclear Leadership Education Program at MIT. Hi, Alan. How are you?
Nice to see you again, Sharon.
And Alan was also, before he went to MIT, was head of the back end of the fuel cycle in North America for AREVA. So we're going to talk today about some issues associated with dry storage and spent fuel reprocessing and the dilemma that Japan finds itself in.
Okay.
So having been part of our workshop on Japanese fuel cycle decisions, beyond restarting the nuclear power reactors, what do you see as Japan's main challenges moving forward? Not from an industrial perspective, but from a, how does Japan maintain its kind of non-proliferation leadership and credibility while moving forward with all its fuel cycle plans?
Well, to my mind and to date, Japan has sterling credentials in the non-proliferation area. They have certainly not done anything to proliferate sensitive technologies or materials, and that is certainly a good thing. They have been given rights through the U.S.-Japanese Cooperation Agreement for fuel cycle activities which have not been granted to many other countries in the world. And so that leaves Japan in a very unique situation, a trusted situation with the United States, but one which I think causes some uncertainty and concern with other countries in the world and in the region.
Let's just, when you say fuel cycle capability, some of our watchers are not going to know what that means. What does that mean?
Okay, there are two sensitive areas of the fuel cycle. The first one is enrichment of uranium, and the second one is separation of plutonium from used fuel, generally referred to as reprocessing. And the reason that these two technologies are sensitive is because the concentration of materials, whether they are uranium-235 or plutonium, is the first step in creating materials for nuclear weapons, as well as creating material for fuel in reactors.
So they have two purposes. Can be used for peaceful or for purposes or for weapons.
Exactly right, and that's why they're referred to as dual-use technologies. And the core of the international non-proliferation regime is to find a way to put in place, by way of treaty and agreements, a way to verify that countries are using the material that they concentrate for civil purposes and not for weapons purposes.
Mm-hmm. And so Japan is, when we look at countries that have these very specialized capabilities, it's basically a handful, right?
Is.
So we have 31 countries plus Taiwan that operate nuclear power reactors commercially. A lot more have reactors. Research reactors. And of those 31 and plus Taiwan, about 10 have a uranium enrichment capability, maybe 6 have reprocessing, and most of those are nuclear weapon states.
That is correct, yes, that is definitely correct.
And Japan is the only non-nuclear weapon state with both uranium enrichment and spent fuel reprocessing.
And that is correct. That is the special situation I was referring to earlier with regard to the Japanese-U.S. agreement that made that possible.
Because the U.S., now the U.S. doesn't transfer that technology, but it gave Japan certain consent rights in its agreement to do that. So Japan developed its own uranium enrichment, is that correct? And then
that's correct, yes.
Purchased technology from AREVA, is that?
It was AREVA's predecessor, Kojima, from which they purchased the technology.
That's for the spent fuels, the separation,
fuel reprocessing,
the reprocessing.
Yes. But in fact, the technology for doing the chemistry separations is really quite elementary. You can buy a textbook for less than $100 that will tell you everything you need to know in order to go about doing the separations. It's straightforward chemistry.
But let's put people at ease here and say that most suppliers are not going to give you the equipment. So, if the bad guys, we're not talking about countries, but for example, terrorists were interested in doing that, they would know how to do it, but it might be difficult to get some of the equipment to do it on a large scale.
It would be, but the equipment is easier to get than the materials. And so the real limitation with regard to being able to turn a used fuel into weapons material is access to the appropriate materials, much more than the equipment. And the equipment that's necessary in order to do it is pretty large. This is not something that you can do in a cave or in a garage. It's a large industrial scale operation. And few countries have mastered it. Relatively few have tried to do it. And unfortunately, most of the countries who've mastered the separations chemistry process did it for weapons purposes rather than for civilian uses.
So why don't more countries reprocess their spent fuel?
There's a variety of reasons for that. One of the analogies I like to think about is the airline industry. Every country in the world seems to have its own national airline, but only about 4 countries actually make airplanes. And that's because the technology to do that and the economics of doing that require a large-scale enterprise. It requires a huge investment, and it requires technological knowledge. The same is true of the sensitive technologies for reprocessing and for enrichment. And so it is only necessary for a handful of countries to do either one of those technologies in order to satisfy the needs of the entire world's nuclear ambitions. And quite honestly, while the enrichment is almost essential for commercial nuclear power, the reprocessing may be desirable for some people, but I would never describe it as necessary.
Right, so most countries, for their power reactors, they fuel them with enriched uranium fuel.
Correct.
And so you can't get there are some technologies that don't require enriched uranium if you have a heavy water reactor.
That's true.
But for the most part, everybody needs that enriched uranium product, but not everybody needs the reprocessing part of it.
That is certainly not everybody needs the reprocessing, and as I said earlier, it would be possible to have a global nuclear enterprise running on light water reactors without any reprocessing whatsoever.
Yeah, and as a matter of fact, it's kind of less, would it be correct to say it's less fashionable to reprocess spent fuel now than it was in the 70s or the 80s?
I'm not sure I'd say fashionable, but I think there is less interest today because the original interest surrounding the reprocessing technology was associated with 2 things. One, a fear that we would run out of uranium, a fear that has never turned out to be real. And secondly, there was a feeling that eventually the light water reactor technologies, which you're using today, would eventually be succeeded by fast reactor technologies. And the fast reactors, you need to do the reprocessing in almost all designs in order to feed those reactors.
And we're not there yet.
We are not there yet, and we're not close to being there yet, in my personal view.
And so in the meantime, this reprocessing, so Japan is a very resource-poor country.
It is.
Most, unless you know something particularly about Japan, you're probably not aware that it's 96% or 97% dependent on overseas energy resources. And so Japan in particular thought that it would use this reprocessing with fast reactors to breed plutonium and therefore actually create its own energy source. We're in a situation now where not only does that look, or it's a whole lot less optimistic now, but there are no nuclear power reactors operating in Japan since the Fukushima Daiichi accident 3 years ago. So at the same time, there are no nuclear power reactors operating. The reprocessing plant hasn't started up yet because there's a new one and it's been delayed in its opening.
It has not started up commercial operations. However, it has been virtually completed, and some of the testing and early commissioning operations have taken place already.
All right. But Japan also has a large stockpile, about 10 tons of separated plutonium already in the country.
Yes.
37 tons overseas, separated plutonium, which poses some security risks. And it has no final disposal for its waste. In that context, can you talk about dry storage of that spent fuel and why Japan might need to do more in that regard?
Okay, well, first of all...
and tell us what dry storage is, since you're the expert.
First of all, let me say that you've laid out the case for why it was that Japan wanted to have a closed fuel cycle, including reprocessing. It was primarily for energy security because they are resource poor. And in fact, the situation is almost identical to the situation in France, which drove the French in the 70s to make the same decision. And of course, the French did things a lot faster and more successfully than has been done in Japan so far. And that's just a matter of history right now. It was believed by almost everybody in the early nuclear enterprise that we would be doing recycling on the large scale. And so when the reactors were built, it was decided to have a small pool next to each reactor to take the spent fuel, and that was to sit there for a relatively short period of time before it would be shipped off-site to be reprocessed, and eventually the waste materials would go to a repository. That was the original vision, and that completed vision has taken place nowhere in the world yet. And in most places, we're not even close to creating that total vision.
Except for the limited storage for the spent nuclear fuel.
That became a reality, yes.
Yeah, true.
And and it was because of that that there was a transition in some countries, including the United States, Germany, Switzerland, Belgium, a number of other countries, to move into dry storage. And that was done when the capacity in those storage pools at the reactors became too small to take any more spent fuel. And so in order to continue operations, material had to be moved out of the pools. And when it was moved out of the pools, instead of putting it in another pool, if it was cold enough, which means that it was on the order of 5 to 10 years old, after coming out of the reactor, then you can put it into a cask that is air-cooled, and there is no water, there is no liquid. Concrete shielded, a steel container, either a very, very thick steel container by itself with some polyethylene around the outside, or else a thinner steel container with a lot of concrete around it. But that technology is well developed in many countries in the world, and without it, most of the reactors in the United States today would have had to cease operating a long time ago.
And basically, you put those concrete or those containers on concrete pads.
That's
right?
correct, yes.
And they're fairly secure.
They're more than secure. They are very secure. They are very safe. The physics of dry storage are such that once you get them out of the water in the pool, there is almost no driving force to cause a dispersal of radioactive materials. So it is extremely safe once it is in the dry storage containers.
And as a matter of fact, the spent nuclear fuel that was in dry storage at the Fukushima Daiichi plant was fine.
Yes, that's true. And fortunately, as it turns out, the fuel in the storage pools also was fine. But there are hypothetical scenarios under which that would not have been the case.
Right. So placing the spent nuclear fuel in these air-cooled casks buys you how much time?
Almost an infinite amount of time because the containers are so robust that while they have a licensing limitation that may vary between 40, 60, 100 years, the containers don't fall apart in that time frame, and so you could store spent fuel almost indefinitely in the dry containers.
And so in Japan, which has some dry storage capacity, but not a lot, what would you recommend for them to move forward on? Given that we understand their political, even though dry storage is very safe and secure, there are still some public opinion issues with storing any nuclear irradiated fuel, spent fuel.
Well, different countries have taken different approaches when they moved into dry storage. There hasn't been a real perceived need in Japan to do this on a large scale, again because of the presumption that fuel was going to go to Rokasho for reprocessing, and therefore it could be removed from the sites without doing dry storage. In the United States, as reactors run out of space, they do dry storage at the individual reactor site. In countries in Europe, they transport the fuel to a central location from the reactors, so each reactor site does not have its own storage. So there are different ways to do it. Japan is looking very carefully at dry storage because they will probably have to move into this direction, and they are looking into the centralized approach rather than doing it at each individual reactor, which to my mind makes sense in Japan because of the tight political relationship between the reactors and the local communities in this country would make it very difficult for each one of those sites to get permission to do dry storage.
Given where Japan is right now, there's flexibility, so-called flexibility, but not a lot of specificity about how they're going to move forward, in part because I think the government is still uncertain about public opinion. What do you think, maybe not the best way forward, but some elements of a good approach for Japan would be?
But I can say with no uncertainty that the capability to do dry storage on a large scale already exists. Many of the containers which my company built in the United States and are loaded and in use in the United States were fabricated here in Japan. And so there are factories which have experience making containers already and which could be geared up to make virtually as many containers as would be needed to do dry storage. So Japan has the capability of doing as much dry storage as they want. It's a matter of local politics and national politics with regard to how far they decide to invest into doing dry storage. Whether or not they will need to do that on a large scale depends very much on how many reactors get restarted in Japan, when they get restarted, and then if and when Rokasho goes into operation, and goes into operation at a rate that would relieve the pressure on the spent fuel pools. There are just too many unknowns in that question to really give a recommendation. I think that one of the reasons that there has not been a perceived need to rush into dry storage is because the Japanese know that they can do it when the time comes, and so they are really not very worried about being pressured into doing it. It's not something that takes a 10 or 20 year development period.
Well, that's good news.
I think it is good news, yes.
Alan, thank you for talking with me today. Really appreciate it.
You're welcome.